Welcome to ALGINKGO, your virtual campfire talk with fellow eclectics, kindling knowledge synthesis.
So far, a little bit cool here, but looks like we're ready to go here. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. May it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to join us this moment, this hour or so, when we once again have a discussion with our dear brother Abdul Karim. Assalamu alaikum, dear brother. Welcome to where are we? 2023 already. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing?
We're not getting any younger, as we say in Canada.
No, not at all. But we're moving on into a new year here, and we have had a nice discussion so far about many things pertaining to aberrant interpretations of the Quran and to a certain degree, the traditions which have been a cause of concern, if not misguidance, amongst the Muslim Ummah for a millennium now, if not longer. So we're pushing on now to find out why this occurred, who was involved, how it occurred. And last week we covered a bit of a review of the sessions that we had done in 2022. And I was very interested in moving forward past the Abbasids and past the Umayyads and, that sort of influence their influence that occurred during the first 200 years following the Prophet's death, peace be upon him, and how it is that they reverted to a worldly system rather than a divine system of governorship, and had abandoned, if you will, the Medina Charter in deference to the dynastic system that had governed most of the world, if not all of the world, except for the few indigenous populations here and there, amongst the organized, so-called civilized world, religions, congregations of people, the Ummah in general, and Muhammad's Ummah in particular, which was meant to reestablish, revise, renew the Abrahamic covenant, which in itself was somewhat similar to the Medina Charter, from what I can understand, of those who served him during the time, or served with him during the time that he had established this covenant to, how shall we say, govern those who chose to be governed by him according to divine guidance. Because what we're concerned about is, in fact, guidance. We're not so much concerned with socio-political theories and all that sort of thing. We have a scripture. There's nothing wrong with the scripture. The scripture is very straightforward. There's our source creator, as Instructor Benjamin Bilal describes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think just about everyone can agree with that particular phrase, source creator, as a descriptive. Even scientists can agree and accept that term. I would think so. I've read some of the works of some of the greatest philosophers and physicists of the age, and they're all sort of turning around in their materialism and saying, look, all the evidence says it's intelligent, and intelligence has to come it doesn't come from nothing. You see, a rock doesn't have intelligence. The intelligence necessary to create a creature that is living and can regenerate itself, let alone regenerate a new generation, you see, recreate a new generation. So, this idea of the seed and generation and all that sort of thing has been perverted in the ancient mystery religions into some sort of fertility cults here, there, and everywhere. And you got gods and goddesses and God knows and dragons and all sorts of creepy crawlies and monsters in the middle of the night who go bump. And the scripture says, hey, there's none of that here. We've got God, our source creator. We've got creation, and we've got man, and we've got purpose. And what is that purpose? Well, the purpose is to honor our source creator by governing what is in creation. And man accepted that task according to what it is said in the Al-Quran and other inferences. And the dialogue that's been going on between our source creator and man has been a long one and has many, many, many historical inferences and instances, and aside from the myths and the analogies, and it all boils down to this. If you want to live in peace with yourself and with your neighbor, which is the purpose of Islam, and establishing peace is much more important than prayer or what they call salat, if we are to accept the testimony of those who said that's what the prophet said. And I think that's a pretty good assessment. Islam's purpose is to establish peace between ourselves, our source creator, and each other. Well, Brother Karim said, war, according to these traditionalists, many of whom are major, major influences in the history of Islam, became a major objective in order to spread the religion of peace. Please, 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 do you understand, dear listener, how crazy that is? How illogical that is? No. Something's wrong. And we're trying to figure out how this happened. We're trying to relate how it happened that Islam, the religion of peace, became to be recognized by non-Muslims as a religion of war. And I used to think, oh, well, they're just mistaken. No, Brother Karim says, no, they're not mistaken. It was an official policy. It became an official policy. For God's sake, what's wrong with our ulama? That they haven't corrected this. And if that became an official policy, you see, what else went along with it? What other errors entered Islam along with it? You see? So that's what we're trying to rediscover and revise in our knowledge base and discuss as intelligently as we possibly can. And so I welcome you once again, Brother Karim, and thank you for for the opportunity to share with you my questions, my queries, if you will, into this realm as a bit of an outsider with both one foot on the outside, one foot on the inside, if you will, of, as I've been described by some people, some other academics. I'm wondering if we can move on past, not that we won't revisit the Umayyads and the Abbasids and their eras, which are many and major, but can you tell us, if you don't mind, what you know about the formation of the Fatimid Empire, how that came into being as a, how shall we say, the opposite side of this divisive coin, which is now recognized as the Sunni-Shia divide, which describes the Muslim Ummah in very real terms, unfortunately, even today. You see, the Fatimids came into power about 150, 170 years or so after the death of the Prophet, and they continued to be a power in Egypt, in North Africa, and in the Hijaz, if you will, for the next 260, 270 years, leading us straight into the era of the Crusades. So we're talking about a 500-year period here, if you will, after the death of the Prophet. And this um, this Fatimid Empire is often it goes often undiscussed. I mean, I spent several years amongst the ulama, and almost nobody discussed the Fatimids. It was just, you know, they jumped from the Umayyads and the Abbasids right straight to uh, Salahuddin. It's as if the Fatimids were just a burp, if you will. And I don't think that's the case, because I know from my own research that Adam Weishaupt in the 18th century took up the principles that founded the Fatimid Empire and reestablished them in Western Europe as principles that he used to establish a secret society called the Illuminati. Now, many people think that the Illuminati has gone extinct, but no, they've just changed their names and changed their guys. This is just a crypto elitist school of malefactors, as far as I'm concerned. And this is the same sort of thing that happened to the Ummah, not only amongst the Ubayyads and the Abbasids, but primarily and directly led us to the Fatimids, if I'm correct in my observations at this great distance, you see. So that's what I understand. Is there anything that you wish or care to or are capable of adding to that perspective, or perhaps correcting? You know, please, brother, inshallah, um, tell us what you know.
Yes, thank you, Brother Omar, once again for having me on for this discussion and sharing, thoughts, comparing notes, so to speak. I think of these meetings as kind of brainstorming sessions. So let's hope that after the storm there will be some peace and the dust will settle, and hopefully that our
Yes.
knowledge will will be better than when we started out.
Mm,
So let me just first do my yes. The one thing I would like to add on the tails
mhm,
of our last discussion
mhm,
is that the Shi'i faith or the Shia faith
mhm.
did not apparently endorse this concept of jihad al-talab the way the Sunni ulama did. So
Is
we
that
have
so?
to, yes, which came as something of a surprise to me as well,
Mhm,
because if you look at the Shia doctrine in toto, you will definitely notice a certain political overtones running through it. You know,
mhm,
its emphasis on the imamate, on the leadership, and I mean, not that I want to make unflattering comparisons, but the communists had, the leadership of the proletariat, the avant-garde, well, and many other ideologies, of course, had similar sort of classes of leadership people. In Shia Islam, we find the leadership of the imams that were passed on down, I guess, from Ali, who was considered to be the first Shia imam. So there's clearly, and of course we have also the concept of the rule of the fuqaha articulated in, I think, mainstream Shia doctrine. So, despite all these political elements, I think, in the teaching of the Shia faith, yet they somehow managed to refrain from embracing this doctrine of jihad al talab, or spreading Islam by the sword, so to speak.
mhm,
Because
mhm,
let us remind ourselves, so there's no mistake, Jihad al-Talab is a doctrine that was advocated by at least five major ulama, including Imam al-Shafi, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd, and even Imam al-Ghazali, you see. So all these people embraced the teaching that, which they elevated to the sixth pillar of Islam, that the Muslim community has to go to war against non-Muslims every year, once a year, even when the non-Muslims are not attacking the Muslims. The last part especially is key because the last part makes it clear that this is clearly a war of aggression, which
Mm-hmm.
is prohibited in the Quran. So here the ulama have departed from the Quran, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
and as I have argued in our previous discussion, not only did they depart from the Quran, but they also departed from, as I can see, the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet,
Mm-hmm.
of which we find evidence in the very charter, the Medina Pact that we have been discussing, which was a defensive pact and
Mm-hmm.
was not at all in any way, there's no evidence in it that it supported in any way converting non-Muslims to Islam by force. So I would just like to emphasize that the Shia faith did not embrace this doctrine of spreading Islam through, unprovoked wars of aggression, which, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
are also illegal under contemporary international law.
Mm-hmm.
And the Nazi leaders during the Nuremberg trials, 22 of them were charged with war crimes,
Mm-hmm.
big crimes against humanity. Why? Because they participated in waging a war of aggression. Now,
Mm-hmm.
even non religious people will agree that it's legitimate to defend yourself against attack. So that is clearly permitted in the Quran, and even common sense will
Mm-hmm.
tell you that you are justified in defending yourself. But to
Mm-hmm.
go to a neighbor and threaten him that unless he converts to Islam or is willing to pay you some protection money, and then to threaten him that or her that you will kill him if he fails to do either the conversion to Islam or pay the jizya and come under your political and military jurisdiction, that is clearly a classic, a very clear defiance and violation of the Quranic injunction that there be no compulsion in religion.
Yes.
So this was a major disaster, I think, in traditional exegesis and jurisprudence. And even people like Yusuf al-Qaradawi recognized it because in his book published in 2009 called The Fiqh of Jihad or The Jurisprudence of Jihad, which is a voluminous book, but 1,400 pages, but you can find shorter book reviews online. You can Google,
Mm-hmm.
for example, what is new in Qaradawi's, Yusuf al-Qaradawi's Fiqh of Jihad, and you will come across a website. In fact, it was put up by a former colleague of mine, and he has included on his website two book reviews of that book, one by Rashid Ghanouchi, who, by the way, gives a very good summary in one of his paragraphs of what Jihad al-Talab is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And the second book review also sums up and examines al-Qaradawi's arguments, which basically boil down to the view that the traditional ulama, how do I put this? He basically argues that there is basically no justification in revelation for waging wars of aggression or jihad al-talab. In other words, that it was, let's put it mildly and say that it was a step. It was not a step in the right direction. So what
Mm-hmm.
we see in al-Qaradawi's work now is a kind of backpedaling on this concept,
Mm-hmm.
backing away from it officially, by the way, because before
Mm-hmm.
that, very few people dared to talk about this topic. Even I was personally, prevented, as it were, by my own boss at the time,
Mm-hmm.
Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali, who is still the chief executive officer of the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies. I
Mm-hmm.
was actually in the middle of writing a paper on jihad. I basically wanted to find out what is all this jihad about. And halfway through the paper, I get an email from the head of human resources saying that the boss doesn't want you to write the paper in jihad. So I had to drop the idea, and I did.
Mm-hmm.
You have to obey those in authority among you, I suppose, as the Quran puts
Mm-hmm.
it. But after leaving the institute, I went back to that topic. I finished the paper, and when I was doing that, I realized probably why he didn't want me to work on this topic is because there's really a lot that is very, very problematic in this doctrine of jihad, al-talab. And I recall him personally saying one time in a meeting that the whole division of the world into Darul Islam and Darul Harb, which is part of the teaching, which forms a kind of a background to this doctrine
Mm-hmm.
of waging wars of aggression, Professor Kamali, mentioned in that meeting that this division of the world into Darul Islam and Darul Harb is not supported in the Quran. It's not mentioned there, and that it was a kind of a later addition or innovation even by some of the hawkish or militant ulama, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to clear that up and put the Shia faith, so to speak, as it were, in the clear on this issue, that whatever else
Mm-hmm.
they perhaps might have gotten, whatever other problems there may be
Mm-hmm.
in their understanding of, as we would say, Islam. This is certainly not one of them.
Yes, I,
They
I understand that, but I also understand that the Fatimids weren't at the time that they came into power. They weren't particularly what we would consider Shia at this point. I mean, Shia simply means something like a sect or a subdivision of the general faith. Sectarians who didn't go along with the general perspective, and it had to do something with the incursions that the Sunnis at the time made into Persia. And so it developed over the centuries, but at the time of the Fatimids, it wasn't considered Shiism. It was something else, quite different. It grew out of this occult society, and the Batini, the Batanites. I'm not saying that correctly, probably, but their persuasion, which led people to believe, well, there's an occult underpinning of the Quran, and they're the ones who understood it, and the Sunnis didn't understand it. So you follow our path, and we're going to lead you to the true God, because they've abandoned the true God, and we've got it right. So all the cultists they sort of take that position. So I agree with you, and I'm happy to hear that the Shias hadn't adopted that position, but the Batinis in Fatimid they certainly did, from what I understand. So there, that differentiation wasn't necessarily present as a political power at the time, because while the Sunnis, or what became the Sunni body, and what became the Fatimid body, they were still at war with each other, and they were spreading their persuasion, their political sway by the sword, and apologizing for the bloodshed with Islam, you see, or their particular persuasion, their particular view of Islam. So, what differentiated the Umayyad persuasion and um, uh, the Abbasids from the Fatimids? I mean, what aside from their genealogical fantasy, of having descended from Fatima, what differentiated them, despite the fact that they were both using the sword to spread their sects?
Yeah, well, as far as the Fatimid use of the sword, I have no doubt that they made plenty of use of the sword.
Mm,
Apparently, the Fatimid ideology was initially spread by a Da'i fellow called Abu Abdallah, who started preaching in Northwest Africa, I believe, and he managed to get some followers. And later there was another fellow. His name was, I believe, Abdullah al-Mahdi Billah, he became the first Fatimid caliph, and he kind of carried it further. He was the first political leader of this movement. And they kind of, as far as the conquests were concerned, they kind of worked their way towards Egypt and eventually conquered also Cairo and made it their capital. Although, if my sources don't deceive me, they did not have much success in convincing the broader Egyptian population to adopt the Shia Islam as a creed. So
Mm-hmm.
there was apparently still a fair bit of sympathy for the Sunni perspective. But to go right back to the beginning, as you know, and as we have touched on before, I think the whole sectarianism, the split between the Sunnis and the Shia, clearly, unless I'm missing something, goes back to the question, to the political question of succession. Who had the right to succeed the Prophet as the leader of the Muslim community? And this is the traditional narrative that we get. The narrative
Mm-hmm.
says that, well, the Shias claim that the Prophet appointed, his son-in-law Ali, who was married to the Prophet's daughter Fatima, that
Mm-hmm.
the Prophet apparently made a statement to appoint him to be the leader. However, this was taken away from him by the alleged usurpers. This is part
Mm-hmm.
of the Shia narrative.
Yes.
The so-called, the three friends, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Osman. So the Shias consider them to be usurpers who took power without authorization from the Prophet. So the difference between Shiism and Sunnism, I think, goes back to this political question of succession. And of course, as we know, in history, there were later political conflicts and people died on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
In the first fitna alone, there were two battles, the Battle of the Camel and the Battle of Siffin. And according to Muhammad Shahrur, there were 15,000 Sahaba who died in the so-called first fitna alone, which was
Mm-hmm.
made up of these two battles. As you know, the Battle of the Camel, Aisha was apparently with some help from others, was
Mm-hmm.
leading an army against Muawiyah, and there was really a fair bit of bad blood, and
Mm-hmm.
so this went on later on, and there was also a battle between Yazid, and then there was the slaughter at Karbala, and
Mm-hmm.
because Hussein was perceived as a threat to Yazid's rule, so this was, as it were, part two of that, basically the same conflict. This was, I think, a struggle for power. It was a classic power struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And this is nothing new in history. I mean, we have, for example, in the United Kingdom, the internecine civil wars. Among them also, we have the so-called War of the Roses, where two houses, so to speak, two families competed over who was going to rule England.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, we had, of course, a split between the Catholics and the Protestants,
Mm-hmm.
and that is similar to the Shia Sunni split. There were some doctrinal differences, but politics had a fair bit to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when Henry VIII declared independence from the Catholic Church, he also confiscated all the property of the church, all the monasteries, and he refused to pay, to the church. It was like, as it were, refusal to pay something similar to zakat. Yeah. So again,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
there was money played a role here.
Mm-hmm.
And in the American War of Independence, as we know, also your country, the American people resented the domination of the British Crown over the affairs of their community, and especially to having to pay taxes to the British Crown. So again, once again, there was an issue of money involved. I even
Mm-hmm.
recall one time telling my students when I was teaching a history class back in Toronto, some time ago, that I told them I was thinking of writing what I would call the quote money theory of history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
About how
Mm-hmm.
these conflicts basically take place over assets, and if we
Mm-hmm.
include natural resources like oil, tin, whatever resource, land and fresh water, I mean, then it becomes very clear that a lot of the conflicts between nations boil down to conflicts over land and resources, in other words, over assets. And basically, it boils down to a power struggle. Even the Nazis, when they attacked the Soviet Union, they claimed that they wanted what they called Lebensraum. In German, in English, that means
Mm-hmm.
living space, as if they didn't
Mm-hmm.
have enough at the time. So they wanted the land of the Russians, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
of course the resources and what have you. So that's how I see the origins of the conflict. And unfortunately, for some reason, these wounds keep festering. They don't seem to heal, because Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran that if someone does something bad to you, you should do something good to that person in
Mm-hmm.
return, and you will see, as if by miracle, the two of you will become like childhood friends or bosom friends, which is exactly
Mm-hmm.
what the Prophet did when he sent gifts to the leaders of the Quraysh when he was coming back to Mecca at the head of an army of 10,000 armed men. And he
Mm-hmm.
was in a position to take the city by force very easily because he held the upper
Mm-hmm.
hand, and yet he refrained from doing that. He didn't take it by force. Yeah, Allah says also there's no compulsion in religion. Instead, he gave a general amnesty to his former enemies, with a few exceptions, perhaps, depending on whose historical account you believe. And he sent gifts to his former enemies. In other words, he did
Mm-hmm.
exactly what Allah Ta'ala recommended, or he
Yes.
guides us to do in the Quran, which is to do something good to the person who does something bad to me. So that I kind of improves even on a Christian dictum of turning the other cheek. If somebody slaps me on
Mm-hmm.
one cheek, I offer him the second one, the other one, and say, please hit me again. This is better than offering the other cheek. You actually do something positive to that
Mm-hmm.
person. And when you
Mm-hmm.
do that, I think you will put that person to shame, and he or she will realize, oh, how wrong I was to treat this nice person so badly. I regret it. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to be hostile to him anymore. So there's some psychology at work here also.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it seems that the mainstream Shia faith is unable to forgive and overlook and move past what happened in history. You know, in
Mm-hmm.
Canada, we have a saying: when somebody keeps, fretting over something bad that happened to him, we sometimes say to the person, "Oh, come on, get over it. You know, get over it. You know, put it
Mm-hmm.
behind you. It's water under the bridge." Well, it
Yes.
seems that many people do not seem to be able to get over it, and they even take steps to remind themselves of it so that they don't forget. You know, and this
Yes. Yes.
rituals where they beat themselves with chains and what have you, those are different ways of reminding themselves that
Mm-hmm.
there was an injustice, great injustice done to them. By the way, we have something similar in Canada, because we have the Quebec province, as you know, is mainly French speaking. And when the English, Canada was first the French were there first, so to speak. But when the
Mm-hmm.
English came, they began to take over and expand. And of course, there was a conflict between the French and the English, which was an extension of the conflict that they were having in Europe. And then there was this so big battle called the Battle on the Plains of Abraham in 1759,
Mm-hmm.
and the French lost. And so now, even to this day, you can see on the license plates of automobiles a little statement at the bottom of every car registered in a province
Mm-hmm.
of Quebec, the following words: "Je me souviens," and that
Mm-hmm.
means I remember. You see, and what is it
Oh,
that
yes.
exactly I
Yes. Yes.
remember? So,
Mm-hmm.
what is it that he is remembering? Well, he
Mm-hmm.
is remembering the plains of Abraham, the defeat
Mm-hmm.
that was inflicted on the French people by the British at the time, and they are not willing or able to forget this and to, as I
Mm-hmm.
said, get over
Yes.
it. You see, so
Yes.
what are you going to do in this case? You know, do people
Mm-hmm.
have what it takes to forgive and overlook and move on, or do they want to live with this trauma and try to get some kind of restitution, even if they have to wait until the end of the world to do so? You know, so I think
Mm-hmm.
this is unfortunate. But if you really
Yeah.
look to the precedent of the Prophet, the real Sunnah of the Prophet, which we have, as we discussed, also is reflected in Pact of Medina, then you will make an effort at the very least to forgive and overlook, and to get over it, and to move forward, and bury the past, and bury the hatchet, so to speak.
Sure.
uh, and establish peace, which is what
Hmm.
the Islamists mainly, it is about peace, you see.
Hmm.
So if we are not able to achieve this peace, well, we need to try harder. We
Hmm.
cannot just remain stuck in this mindset where, oh, I'm
Right.
going to get my revenge one day or whatever, when the
Hmm.
Mahdi comes or whoever, this, or the
Hmm.
hidden imam emerges and what have you, there will be the sort of settling of scores and what have you. I think
Hmm.
this is of course we have something similar, also in a conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians, but there's got to be a way to resolve that issue too without resorting to any more violence. So what is the way forward, at least from the Muslim point of view? Of course, the way forward is what the Quran teaches us and what the real Sunnah of the Prophet, indicates to us,
Hmm.
specifically, particularly in the Pact of Medina. So I
Yes.
think that this is something that we need to work on, all of us. I think the entire
I,
Ummah.
I agree with you. Um, but I just want to remind us of the fact that there are some people you can turn the cheek to, and that's not going to affect them positively at all. They'll just strike it and continue to strike because they're, how shall we say, they're psychopaths, you see. And this element of society is what I'm more concerned about in much of my research, because they form a core. This is a psychopathic core of the organization of political evil, which is what the Fatimids seem to have done. As I look back on it, see, this is why I want to have this conversation because I'm still trying to sort it out what really happened here. And as I see it, you see, with the Quraysh and the Umayyads and the Abbasids, they kind of just fell backwards, into the old bad habits. You see, of the rule by the strongest tribe and the dynastic rule, this sort of thing. But the Fatimids, they organized the evil on a different basis, if I'm to understand my reading correctly of the history, what I do know of the history, which is limited, but nevertheless, I do know some things. And I'm trying to discern what that difference really is, because there were obviously psychopaths at the realm. I mean, if you look at what some of the what became the sultans under the Umayyads and whatnot. They went to war, and when the enemies stopped fighting them, they stopped. Surely there were slaughters, and some of those slaughters were unnecessary. But the Fatimids, to the contrary, were unnecessarily cruel. You see, and they slaughtered people who weren't even fighting them. You see, so, and they slaughtered people just because they didn't agree with them, you see, and this is not necessarily the case. All right, so Hassan was, or Hussein was coming against the Quraysh, and he had to be confronted. And of course, the order was of the day was not to kill him, but they killed him anyway. And that was not necessarily it wasn't necessary, but it was par for the course under the um, consensus of war at the time between the intertribal chieftains. That's what you did. You killed your enemy. You tried to kill their son so they wouldn't come back to you, which is what the mafia does to this day. So um, but then the conflict stops. Once you get the leader and you get his sons and the other guys, their generals and staff and their army, they put their swords down. It's over. You don't have to slaughter everybody. But that's not the case with the Fatimids. The Fatimids went out of their way to slaughter people who weren't fighting them and who just disagreed with them. So there was a big difference here. I mean, I'm sure there were sects of the Sunnis amongst the Umayyads and the Abbasids who didn't agree with them, but they weren't necessarily slaughtered unless they mm, gained too much political sway, one way or another, theological sway, if you will. However, under the Fatimids, this was a different approach. Their approach was just massively cruel. If you if you read some of the histories and understand what was taking place, and they had this Quarmatian pact with the Arabs in some Arabs tribe. These are the same guys that stole the Black Stone eventually, from what I understand. Um, they kind of had an alliance there, and they were just as cruel. And that cruelty is reflected in the terrorists who are running the people who claim Islam but yet are killing the innocent, blowing people up on buses and just shooting people because they want to take their hijab off. And this is just not right. So there's an element of cruelty which is political in nature and not just tribal in nature that's here. And the Fatimids established it according to a certain a particular political persuasion, which was based on some sort of occult initiation rites. And if I understand correctly, these initiation rites were established by a Jew who was pretending to be a Muslim. His name was Abdallah ibn Maimun, if I have his name correctly. And Ibn Khaldun mentions him, but almost nobody I talked to amongst the ulama talk about this guy. And it was his system, Maimun's system, that was adopted by Adam Weishaupt in the 18th century, you see. And it was Maimun's system that led to the political organization of these loosely knit tribal Shias up to that point that then established the Fatimid dynasty. He organized them into what we call these little cells, and he finally got them to realize, okay, well, you're claiming this, that, and the next genealogy, and you got to get your story straight because they're all different, you see. And so he kind of tried to unify the genealogy. He establishes the die upon which the grand teacher of the cult sits and then persuades everyone that this is the way to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's no other way. Our Sultan, whoever's appointed, Jafar, whoever else it might have been, he's the one that is the direct descendant of Ali through Fatima, and he's the one that's divinely ordained. So he's infallible. He's like the Pope. We have to obey him. And as long as we obey him in whatever he says, okay, we're going to be victorious. And for the better part of 300 years, they pretty much were. So that's my understanding. Now, I don't understand everything. Of course not. Who can? But for God's sake, this kind of a power that reigned for 300 years and overshadowed what was once the Umayyads and the opposites until the Ayyubis came along, Salahuddin came along, they must have had an effect on the traditions that came down to us, you'll see. They must have joined hands, however subtly or and theologically and subversively theologically, across the Red Sea and across the Nile, if you will, into the Promised Land, into the Hijaz, to somehow form what came down to us as traditional Islam. And I'm not referring to the divisions between the Shia and the Sunni traditions. I know they have their own books of hadith and whatnot, and they don't always agree. And most of them are probably in some form of error. But there must be something similar about them that affected the entire Ummah and persuaded people to, we're going to follow this, that, or the next persuasion, and we're going to call ourselves Muslim, come hell or high water, because we're all going to honor the prophet. Okay, so one group decides, oh, they're going to remember Karbala and beat themselves bloody and cut their children's head, like pagans, and still consider themselves to be Muslim. Well, if they're going to be that crazy, that what else did they invest in the Ummah across the divide? You see, that has come to us. And I'm sure somewhere along the line in the many, many books that you've reviewed that we don't have access to, people like me, we don't speak Persian. There's no Urdu in my history. There's no Arabic in my history. I look at it and I say, oh my God, I just go bonkers. I just can't do it. I'm one of those 90% of the male population that can't do language. you know, and so that's just the way it is for some of us. So we depend upon scholars like yourself and others of of your caliber to try to inform us as best as possible about these missing pieces of this gigantic puzzle. You see, that is so confusing. So I'm trying to use you, if you will, if and with God's help, to connect some of the dots here, because there are an awful lot of dots and they're not connected. And I'm sure that there are other people aside from myself who would like to hear from people like yourself and say, well, we know the Shia Sunni story, we know the superficial traditions and who did what, and we know about Ali, we know about Hassan, we know about Hussein, we know what Aisha did and didn't do, and da 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 da. But what don't we know? You see, that's really significant. Is what I'm trying to get at here, brother. If you have anything that would help us to connect these dots and shed light on how it is this divide and how it is the Fatimids in particular, which have been inherited by the so-called Illuminati, their system, you see, which is an ancient Persian system which corrupted under the days of Alexander, if you will, by certain people in and around the Babylonian suburbs. We could discuss another time, but the same system, you see, corrupted Islam. It's corrupting the world now, which is why I can't help but think, well, it's got to be important. It has to have left a trail someplace, and this trail is a trail of facts and personages and events that people amongst our ulama don't want to discuss. Can you help us out here, brother?
Yes, thank you, Brother Omar. Well, as you were speaking, I was reminded of the fate of the Mu'tazilites. As you know, they were
Mm-hmm.
the so-called rationalists among the Sunnis. And it so happens we also know very little about them, but we
Mm-hmm.
also know why we know very little about them. One reason is that their works were systematically destroyed, and
Ah.
they themselves were persecuted. I remember, when Stalin conducted his purges, he went, of course, many millions of people died in the gulags and
Mm-hmm.
what, but he went so far as to have the faces of people brushed out of photographs where
Mm-hmm.
they were included along with him and a few other people. That is how
Mm-hmm.
far he went to erase any trace of these people,
Mm-hmm.
in people's memory. And of course, he also sent an assassination squad to kill his arch enemy, Leon Trotsky, who was trying
Mm-hmm.
to find safety in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't work out for him, but the assassination reminds me also of the custom of the so-called assassins among the Ismailis. There was a whole cult called the assassins, and they were known as the Hashishin because they would smoke hashish before they went out to kill somebody. And this was
Mm-hmm.
also a very twisted, perverted custom and belief
Mm-hmm.
which they engaged in until they were finally destroyed in their fort, I believe, by the Mongols who
Mm-hmm.
destroyed them. So that's one reason why we may not know much about certain groups in history is because,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, history books or history accounts are written by the victors. So we
Mm-hmm.
rarely hear the side of the people who were defeated.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the eccentricities of some of the Fatimids, I also recalled one time one of the Fatimid caliphs gave an order to kill all the dogs in his realm, not just the black ones. According to the hadith,
Mm-hmm.
it's only the black dog that gives you bad luck. He gave an order to kill all the dogs because he didn't like being disturbed by the barking of dogs at night when he was trying to sleep. So
Mm-hmm.
this caliph was, his name was Al Hakim, I think. So that's another, eccentricity that but may confirm that perhaps he was a sort of a psychopath or a sociopath.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this question also comes to me quite frequently: is whether we have witnessed what the Orientalists call fanaticism, in
Yes.
any part of the Ummah. Now, I'm usually very careful in using that word. However, this could be discussed because we do know for a fact that there has been a very strong streak of anti-rationalism, and more
Mm-hmm.
so in the Sunni tradition, by the way, than among the Shias.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering whether, anti-rationalism and fanaticism are not really two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
Because does not fanaticism begin when thinking stops? So,
Mm-hmm.
and I would also like to add that, these suicide bombings, actually, to my knowledge, were not carried out by Shias. It was Yusuf al-Qaradawi who issued a fatwa some years ago permitting Palestinians to blow themselves up among Israelis as a sort of part of what he thought was jihad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since then, many people died, and it is usually Sunni extremists that blow themselves up in Shia mosques rather than the other way around, you see, at least in modern recent history. So later on, of course, as we know, he retracted his fatwa and he basically said, I was wrong to do that. But many people have died since then, and the damage has been done already. And
Mm-hmm.
some people are still committing suicide bombings. I just met a fellow today, as a matter of fact, earlier. He was visiting one of the, I think it was Indonesia, and in one place there was a suicide bombing, which was really not
Mm-hmm.
reported in the mass media. But apparently, some people are still taking to this very twisted notion of how to, they think that this is they become some sort of shaheed or martyr, but that is a
Yes.
complete nonsense. Allah said very clearly in Al Quran, verse 29, Surah number 4, La taqtulu anfusakum, that means don't kill yourselves. That is a clear
Mm-hmm.
prohibition against suicide. But
Yes. Yes.
anyway, to come back to the, once again to the, violence of the Fatimids, like I say, I have looked into this and I searched many different places, but I do not find a whole lot of information about the this movement. Although one thing that is clear is that there's no love lost between the Shias and the Sunnis. I recall one time I was attending a talk at the university where I worked as a academic staff member for 5 years, and there was one lady from Iraq. She got up and she started punching the air, with her finger and denouncing the Shias in the strongest possible terms. And
Mm-hmm.
I was quite amazed at the intensity of this lady's hatred.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, so I do not just see, the maybe on the individual level, the Fatimids may have committed some very serious crimes. I'm sure they are not squeaky clean or what have you. But in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the writings and the statements that we have from
Mm-hmm.
the writings of the scholars, I have not come across a single Shia scholar who, approved in writing the doctrine of waging a war of aggression. But I have
Mm-hmm.
five different quotations from five prominent Sunni ulama who have done that, who have basically
Mm-hmm.
justified wars of aggression as a requirement for the Muslims. You see, they did not only make it permissible; they made it into a requirement. You see, that is doubly bad. So I have not come across any information of this nature although I mean, in my reading,
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing that really comes up in the Shia sources, and I have consulted some of my friends who have done reading in these areas, and also they also came up empty-handed, but they're also telling me that waging a war of aggression was actually never justified to their knowledge by any Shia scholar. But now, what the scholars write and what the people do on the ground can very easily be two very different things. So
Mm-hmm.
it may well be that a great deal of violence did transpire, but then again, here comes Salahuddin, and he put a stop to it. You see, so we read in the Quran that we will never find a change in the Sunnah of Allah, and that Allah does not love aggressors. You see, so if they aggressed, they transgressed, and they had to pay the price in the longer term by basically being removed from power, and that's exactly what happened to them. And even now, even today, as you know, Iran is under sanctions, and some people have even mentioned regime change and what have you. Although
Mm-hmm.
I understand that the military, the Pentagon, military brass in the U.S. are advising against, military action against Iran. They don't consider Iran to be a threat. And as we know from recent history, it was once again a Sunni leader, Saddam Hussein, who attacked Iran, not the other way around, you see.
Yes,
And
yes.
he did not attack only Iran, but also Kuwait, another Sunni state, you see. So
Mm-hmm.
again, the extremism here seems to be not on the side of the Shias, but like I said, there may have been some cases of violence that we don't know because it may have been suppressed, or simply the
Mm-hmm.
information is not available, or if it is available, then there's a whole lot of it available.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, one thing is clear, that we have here a competition, between these two creeds. And I know that, for example, the Saudis, judging by the statements of I believe, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, I think in one of the interviews he hinted something to the effect that Shias want to expand their power in the region of influence, and that they need to be basically, prevented from doing that. So there's tension in the region, you see, also. And,
Mm-hmm.
the time will tell. But when I said, when I was referring, by the way, to the turning of the other cheek, I wasn't recommending that for the Muslims. Obviously not. What I'm recommending for Muslims, no, don't turn the other cheek. Do something good to your enemy. That's what I'm recommending, because that's what Allah recommends, and that's what the Prophet did.
Alhamdulillah.
You see. So
Yes,
let's
yes,
see how
yes.
that works. See if it will bring any results. Yeah. So.
Well, let me make a suggestion here, brother. Thank you very much. Um, I would like to continue these discussions, but with your permission, I think maybe we should open up a little bit more and invite some students to attend a webinar and entertain some Q&A. Would you be willing to do that?
Certainly, I will welcome it. In fact, after all, I've spent nearly 20 years of my life in the classroom, so this is
Okay.
not going to be a new experience for me. Of course, on Zoom, of course, it
All
will be
right.
something new, but
Hmm.
in
Well,
principle, I certainly support it.
let me work on that. Discuss it with my staff at our website and see if we can't manage to do that at the same time every week, and open up the discussion to maybe just a limited pool of students from yourself and whoever that you might have on your mailing list, and whoever we have on our mailing list amongst our students, and see if we can't generate further discussion and perhaps learn something. You see, because the students who are interested in conversations like this, they're protean, okay? So they're out there doing their own research, and they may have overturned stones and looked under them and found things that we don't know about. So I think it might be time to do that, especially since we're in the new year here, 2023, to push ahead and expand our horizon here and invite them and see what comes of it by Allah's will. And if you're in agreement, we'll look into that, and we'll try and get it started as early as next week. And I don't see any reason why
Inshallah.
we couldn't,
Yeah.
inshallah. So, unless you have anything to add, brother, I'll just close here. And with God's permission, we'll meet again next week and see if we can't host a webinar.
Yeah, thank you. I would just add that I look forward to that expanded format. It will be more like a seminar and a brainstorming session. And you are
Okay.
quite right. We can certainly learn from others as well. And we are all students in this, and this is all work in progress for us. So it doesn't matter where the truth comes from, as long as it is the truth, we should appreciate it and cherish it. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Then, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until next week, brother.
Until next week. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.